Hello. Oh, it's loud. All right. It's like I'm pretty sure I got the count right. Who's missing?
Who are you missing? Does this represent the audience?
No, I thought there were 7. Oh man, I'm starting to freak out.
Say the 7 shares the audience.
Oh, there you go. Ed. All right. Ed, you can go sit down if you want. All right. So I think this turned out to be pretty fun. We had the questions open on the Slido thing. We got around 11, 12 questions. They're still coming in. If we have time, then we don't submit them right now. I'm not going to read it. I'm hoping that if we have some extra time at the end of the answers that we have currently, that we can open it up. But the current format, the way this is going to work is we took the questions and I will ask it, and then I've already identified kind of like who from this group here going to have answer it. They're going to provide an answer. And also too, I think if you have a follow-up question about the answer or you want to discuss it a little bit more, I think it's, let us know and we'll pass you the mic and you can ask a follow-on question. Let's keep like non-related questions until the end. So we'll stick to the questions that were online. All right. Sound good? All right. Rip it. Also too, the first time you speak, maybe you could no intros. Okay, we're good. These guys are, I promise you, they are experts. All right. All right. Has anyone been looking at or running Accumulo on Java 10/11? I'm going to have Josh answer that.
So,
And also stand up in your answer. Wait, really? Yeah, so there's a camera.
yes, Don. So the general gist of what I've seen, and I think this is pretty common across projects at the ASF, is that there's a general trend for people to have tried to start looking at Java 9 and 10 in general, but a lot of people have been pretty reticent to say, we're going to put whatever official, we support that version of Java 9 or 10, just because of the fact that Oracle itself, they are saying, hey, we're not doing a long-term supported release on these. So the general feel from the community has been, we aren't going to invest time from a community standpoint to say, we're also going to do extensive testing, because if the vendor themselves are saying, we're not going to produce a Java that's long-term, why would we invest that time? So the general feeling that I've seen in Accumulo and across other project-related projects has been sort of wait and see what happens with Java 11. So I think they officially had a real release of Java 11 within the past month or two. So the general impression I have is that I think you'll start to see a lot more testing start to happen with Java 11 now. There's been some efforts that have gone into Accumulo so far with 9 and 10 to sort of keep the compatibility going. But I think the lack of an official Java 11 statement right now has been for other reasons, and you'll see that change within the next couple months, especially with some like 2.0 testing stuff that we'll talk about later.
Okay. Thanks. Any follow-ups on that? Any follow-ups on that? No. All right. Are there any issues with Accumulo and OpenJDK? And I'm going to have Keith answer that.
Not that I know of. All I can say is that I've used OpenJDK in all the release testing I've done for Accumulo and Fluo, and that usually involves running Accumulo on like a 10-node cluster on EC2 for 24 to 48 hours. And those tests have used OpenJDK from CentOS, so it's kind of like Red Hat's version of OpenJDK.
Any questions on that? Any follow-up? All right. Does Accumulo run in containers and specifically on Kubernetes? And I'm going to have Ed answer that first. Billy first.
Hey, let's see. So Accumulo definitely has been run in containers. I'm not aware of anyone running it in production. A question to go along with that is where is the storage going to be? At least in my experience, HDFS has been running outside the container if you want persistent storage for that Accumulo instance. As far as Kubernetes, I'm not aware of anyone having done that yet, although I wouldn't necessarily anticipate any problems with that.
And I just wanted to add to this, that I know people that are doing, they'll spin up Docker containers for testing. So it's not actually the functionality of Accumulo that they're testing, but it's the functionality of the applications that are built around it. So it certainly runs at least to be a functional point, so.
Any other questions, follow-up questions on that? That one was a little bit deeper than the other ones we got. All right. The next question is, can you run Accumulo on AWS? Is there anything I need to watch out for? I'm going to have Adam start with that one.
Let's see. So the short answer is no if you're going to be storing the data on S3. There's some inconsistencies with S3 since it's an object store, not a file system. Accumulo requires that once that file is written, it has to be there, and there's some race conditions where if you write a file and then ask S3 for the file, it might not be there at that time. And there's also, I heard, some issues with flushing. The sync call, Accumulo, when it says sync, it has to be written, but that also might not show up for a little time. As far as Accumulo itself, there shouldn't be any issues there much with like the containerization of running it on an EC2 instance or on ECS. You just kind of have to use a real HDFS cluster, whether it's real in Amazon or real elsewhere. You still have to use HDFS as that storage layer.
And Josh was good. Do you want to add? I forget what I forgot. All right. Any other questions about Accumulo on AWS or GCP or something? Yeah.
Were the problems, main problems you had that was the write ahead log?
I'll let you state it.
Were your main problems running on S3 with the write-ahead log?
So I guess I should say I haven't done this just because of these problems with it. You can also search like through the user list because the question pops up from time to time, and there might be some more in-depth answers in there. But it's really just issues with the API that you might run into issues with, and the write-ahead log would be one of those. Yeah, with all like the sync and flush calls.
Any other questions about Accumulo on AWS? I know of several production Accumulo clusters running on AWS, but it's mostly just like it's like infrastructure as a service. They just have the machines running and they're using direct attached storage and all that stuff. So, all right. This is a fun one. What are some barriers of adoption of Accumulo outside of government? And who wants to start?
So you're aware Josh is supposed to be the counterpoint to this. The big one, in my opinion, is robust SQL support. This happens both for Accumulo and other key value stores. That what really seems to be a limiting factor in new adoption by developers is that the vast majority of developers are not prepared to deal with the complexities of our Java API, and what they want is something they can plug into JDBC or ODBC and just query, because to them, we're a data store. We're not like, I don't want to say not worth the effort, but like the barrier to entry for willing to do something other than SQL is pretty high.
And the counterpoint is really not as intuitive as it says. I think you can get away with SQL, with things that aren't quite SQL. I think you see this a lot. Cassandra is a really good example, and MongoDB is another good example. These are two like very, two other predominant databases in the same space, and they provide a higher level query language. And I think that's, to me, that's a bit more important. The query language, having something higher level is definitely, I agree with Sean here. It's that something that isn't a distributed sorted key value store, because that is very obtuse and very difficult to use, but I think Sean has something to say.
So I went to a great talk today about DataWave, and DataWave provides...
What's DataWave?
It's an ingestion and query framework built on top of Accumulo. So like DataWave provides a query layer, right? It's not SQL. It's not like SQL, but it is it's a higher level abstraction though, right? Like, do you think that's sufficient to drive Accumulo adoption?
So I would say, I think there's another point that, the other thing that I would see that inhibits adoption is a bit of a chicken and egg thing. And that's, I think for the same reason that people want higher level query abstractions on top of it, they want something nicer to use. I think it's also difficult to get people ramped up onto a product because there isn't a great prevalence of expertise in the community already. So I think, DataWave can be a great technology. I think it fits a very good role for what Accumulo needs, but I think there's still an inherent problem of how do you go to a customer and how do you go to a bank and how do you say, hey guys, I think Accumulo would solve a lot of your use cases here. You could put the best marketing pitch together. You could say, this is here are benchmarks to show that the numbers will scale to what you need. It gives the features you need, but unless you can really convince them and show them that they have the expertise on the grounds to then run this stuff, it's really hard to get someone to come back and say, yeah, I'm going to go and try this new technology. So I think there's also a bit of a, even if you do have technology that is sufficient to be easy to use, I think there's still a prevalence of, or a problem, how do you have the expertise in the field? How do you make sure people are not going to be kept up at night because they're worried their database is ultimately going to fall over or something like that? So I think I would temper my answer, maybe 60-40, something like that too.
Any questions on that? Yeah.
I was just curious if you guys had any thoughts on whether or not packaging impacts the availability of Accumulo to these potential commercial users. Like, it's really easy to run MariaDB as or MySQL because you can just do yum install, whatever. Do you think that has any impact on adoption?
I would say not directly, but indirectly, yes. So to Josh's point about the lack of expertise already being available in the greater tech environment, the way you get that kind of pervasive presence is making it easy for the developer who's just messing around with stuff to be able to try out your system. So Unos has actually been great for this. Fluo people, thank you. But that requires about Unos and Muchos, right? Which is already a barrier. And so better availability for a random person to say yum install whatever and then have a thing that they can play with, I think definitely would help. But that's gonna be a super long slog towards somebody hears about Accumulo and then goes and tries to do yum install and then tries to make use of it in their system. And I think once you get past that packaging hurdle, you're gonna run right into the ease of API thing again, right, in my opinion.
Any other questions on that? Okay. The next question is, how do I contribute to Accumulo? Are there any specific areas where you need help? Mike is going to answer that.
So the how to contribute question is pretty easy. The website has a how to contribute page with kind of where the issue tracker is, with the contribution workflow. So I kind of go there, but what to work on can be kind of difficult. We do have help wanted in some of our issues, but whether or not you're interested in that. One recommendation how I started contributing a lot to Accumulo was just I started using it, seeing things that annoyed me, seeing documentation that annoyed me, and just making pull requests on that. So, one way to contribute is just to use Accumulo and fix things that you want to that you think should be fixed. Yeah.
I think one of the things we discussed also too when we were reviewing the questions was specifically maybe some help on, you can also help, and this is true with all open source projects, is it may not necessarily even be programming. It can be in testing and also documentation. Most projects are lacking on. So you don't have to do the glamour work necessarily to be really useful. Okay, thanks. Any other questions on how to contribute? All right. The next question, is it, so we're going from a fairly high level question to a very specific one. Is it a bad idea to use summarizers in 2.0 to compute the cardinality of keys in a table? So I'm going to have Keith first decipher what that question means, and then he will answer it.
So in case you missed my talk this morning, I'll give a quick recap. Summarizers are a new feature that will be in 2.0, and they allow you to generate summary information about the data in your tables. And that summary information is in the form of a map of string to long. So, and you can configure multiple summarizers for each table. The goal for summarizers is that the data, the summaries that you compute, that the user computes, are very small. And the reason is because, like, part of the summarizer framework is a combiner that combines these maps of string to long, and the user has to write that, and those maps have to fit in memory. So there's one limitation. So if your cardinality is high, if I have like 1 billion things and I'm trying to count how many times those billion things occur, you would not want to do that with summarizers. So an example of something that kind of does that is there's a built-in summarizer for counting column visibilities, and I gave an example of that in my talk. And that summarizer just cuts off when it sees, like, after it's seen 5, it's configurable, but I think by default like 1,000 or 5,000 unique column visibilities, and it stops counting them, and it just starts counting that it's not counting them, or it's counting that, oh, these are not being put in the map. So it's just keeping track of that. And then when it combines them, it just takes the ones with the highest counts from the 2 maps, but it still keeps track of those counts of what it's not counting.
Any follow-up questions on that one? Okay. All right, the next question is, what are the options for doing SQL on Accumulo right now? And I'm going to have Adam answer that.
So to piggy off before about having a nice kind of interface for it. So there's a Presto project, which is an open source project that is built by Facebook, Teradata, and then there's this new startup, Starburst Data, that's around Presto. And it's a MPP style execution engine. So they develop the core, which is how to run a SQL query, ANSI SQL, and then you can build in a bunch of extensions on the back end for where you actually get data from. Hive was, I believe, the original source of data. It integrates well with Hive, but there's also connectors for Redis and MongoDB and Kafka. And I had built an Accumulo connector a couple years ago that's open source as well, that we've added some improvements to, with the goal to kind of abstract away common design patterns with Accumulo for like secondary indexes and metrics, and try to make smart optimizations for what you're querying against. We've been using it in production at my customer for, well, since we built it, 2.5 years now or so. There's actually 2 talks last year and the one before if you wanted more info on it. But that's available up on GitHub if you wanted to pull it down and play with it. Yes, Spark SQL. So we've also just recently, I've been working with kind of batch Spark jobs for Accumulo, and there's no like package available, but it's relatively trivial if you're familiar with Spark SQL, in that you can leverage the open source MapReduce input formats for that through this new Hadoop RDD API call, and read the raw key value pairs. And for the jobs that we're doing, we clone the table that we want to copy and then offline the table, and you get much better performance kind of interacting with Spark SQL. And you might just have to do some transformations depending on your data to turn the key value pairs into something maybe more meaningful. You get better performance. The question was, why do you get better performance reading it offline? So with the input formats, the 2 choices are an online scan, where it's actually going to query Accumulo for that data in parallel based on the tablets, and an offline scan, it just skips the Accumulo layer and goes straight for the R files to read the data out of that. So you can get much better performance doing those kind of batch scan operations, which is generally what we've been using it for. We'll use Presto for kind of the live front-end SQL queries, and then for batch stuff, we've been offlining the tables. Good question.
Any follow-up questions on that? Okay. Okay. So this question is, the asker is excited to hear about when Accumulo 2.0 is going to come out and be production quality. And the question was, when can we look for at least a release roadmap if we are not going to get a release date? And I'm going to have Sean answer that first, or Keith. Sean and Keith are going to answer this one. I think Sean first. All right.
Sure, me first. So this is where I wish we had had a talk at Accumulo Summit about Accumulo as an Apache project. So as an Apache project, we don't have a product manager. We don't have a roadmap. We don't have a schedule, except as individuals decide to do stuff. So talking about when 2.0 will be production ready depends entirely upon people deciding to adopt it for production. So like if you want to roll Accumulo 2 into production and you know what it would have to do for you to do that, then come to the user list and say, hey, make sure you do these things so that production users don't get screwed over. And then like the community can try to self-organize to do those things. That would be super helpful. That would be probably the most useful contribution in my opinion, for like a long time. And then if you can actually help with driving those test things for what you want to see it be able to do to be in production, then that's how we get there. It's a non-answer, I'm sorry, but that's all there is.
It's a resetting of expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to talk a little bit more about how Apache projects might work. Like there's specific things I would like to do, like specific testing I would like to do before we release Accumulo 2.0, documentation review, API review. So if someone comes up and says, hey, I'd like to release 2.0 tomorrow, I'd be like, oh, can you please wait? So that's kind of like, we would discuss that on the dev list. And when I get ready with that stuff, or when I get finished with the things that I would like to do, I might say, hey, I'd like to release Accumulo 2.0. Does anyone oppose to that? So it's kind of how, I don't know if that's how all Apache projects work, but that's how maybe some of them work, some open source projects work. So.
All right. Are there any other questions about 2.0 non-roadmap? All right. The next question is, how strong is the affinity of the underlying files to the T servers? And can I run the HDFS rebalancer without issues? Adam.
So this question is about the HDFS blocks and the 3 replicas. So when Accumulo writes out that R file, basically that first replica of the block is going to be local on the data node machine, and you can get performance gains by not having to go through the network. So with the affinity thing is if you run the HDFS balancer, it's going to potentially move the blocks elsewhere across the cluster, and now you have to take a network hit to do that, which is not what you want to do. You don't want to run the balancer. Well, with that said, like you get data skew and you don't really have a choice except to run the balancer. We run the balancer at my customer all the time. We have some skew on ingest that causes some issues, and we haven't had any big performance problems. We pretty much run it constantly at like a very low bandwidth. And over time, like as those blocks move away and Accumulo compacts more data and does more major compactions, it's going to rewrite those R files back, and they will be local at that time. So there's kind of like a short-term penalty as long as your tablets are all compacting. But yeah, it's a short non-answer. You got to do what you got to do.
Any questions on the rebalancer running underneath? All right. Yes.
Are you aware of any like performance benchmarks or anything that have been documented related to like completely like shutting down Accumulo, restarting it, and the like penalty you incur with all the tablets being in different places afterwards?
So,
Good question. So We've actually had that happen, and we run Accumulo on Mesos. The way that the tablet reassigner works is it tracks the last location where the tablet was, so it will reassign it to the previous tablet server. But in our use case, the port changes with how Mesos does, so we actually effectively get a brand new Accumulo cluster every time, which I hadn't thought about it that way before, but that's basically what it is. And again, we haven't really seen any major performance issues as far as like hitting our SLAs. But yeah, good question.
Any other questions about that? All right. The last planned question we have is, do scan executors in 2.0 support preempting lower priority scans or simply take precedence when a thread is allocated? I have Keith again decipher what the question is asking and then answer the question.
No, the scan executors don't support preemption. There is something that was added in 1.9. It'll also be in Accumulo 2.0. There's something for iterators for yielding. So it's kind of like cooperative multitasking where an iterator can say, oh, I've been running for a while and I'm going to yield, and you can start me back where I was. So that would probably be the route to take.
All right. Any questions about that one in particular? All right, so that's it for the planned questions. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to add now? This is very comprehensive. I think there were some that were added. All right. Alex is going to look up other questions that were added. Are there any other questions out there? One of the first pieces of advice I got when I was teaching, I asked my professor that was mentoring me, what should I do when I ask if there's any questions? And they say, and there's no questions. Is to wait until it's awkward enough that somebody asks a question.
We could be here a long time.
Just going to have Sean stare out into the audience.
Do the undo the iterators one?
Yeah, we did that.
Why Accumulo over HBase over Mongo?
Ooh, no. Actually, we can do it. Let's go into. There was one question. Yeah. Okay. We did not. We kind of did, but we didn't. One of the questions was, if you're new to iterators, what are some gotchas that you should be aware of, and things you should probably not do and do? So who wants to answer that one? I think it was Josh. I think Josh was going to. Josh was talking to.
Ivan gave me the rundown before we came in here, so I believe I'm double expert now. At least maybe one expert. So there are a lot of gotchas. It's
Gotcha number one is lots of gotchas.
yes. So probably the best thing to sort of guide you along there, because it isn't until you see one happening, it's kind of hard to say, oh, I'm going to make this discrete change. I'm going to set this variable to 1, and then I don't hit that issue. It's usually much more higher level stuff. So the best thing to avoid any gotchas is actually to try to use out this iterator testing framework that's in the code base. I think that was like 1.8-ish, something like that. But the whole point of that framework was to be a thing to try to prevent you from running into these sort of what really can be esoteric cases. So things that you could probably run a iterator in production, you could run against your unit test suite, time and time and time again, and you'd never run into this situation. You put in production and you'd find it a month later. So there's things about an iterator being torn down and being reseeked to its last position. There are things about if you try to keep state in an iterator and state in memory as some variable that you don't serialize off and reinitialize later on. There are issues with propagating deletes out of an iterator if you're in the compaction case. So you may introduce old data that you had deleted, or you may drop a delete before it's actually masked the data that it was supposed to get rid of. So there's lots of really weird cases around this, but really the best single source of truth for this would be to look at this iterator testing framework we have, which was meant to sort of codify some of these cases and reproduce them in a standalone environment. And most of the cases that are captured in that framework also have some supporting documentation in the user manual to sort of give a better explanation of, hey, this is why you might actually see this. This is the reason that this is an issue that you need to be aware of.
So kind of as a software maintenance planning issue, for a while now, the project has adopted semantic versioning for our version numbers, which means usually you can tell when you upgrade how big of a risk you're taking. But one thing that's important to note is the definition of our public API, which is where you have those guarantees, doesn't apply to iterators, which isn't to say that like we change them a lot. We try not to, but when you decide you need to make an iterator, you should keep in mind that you probably will have to do more testing on an upgrade than you would if you weren't doing an iterator.
Any questions about iterators overall that people wanted to ask? Maybe like you have a particular iterator that's causing you heartache right now? No. Okay. What was the other one?
What came first, data wave?
One question that came in was what came first, data wave or Accumulo?
I believe
Yeah, are we allowed to answer it?
Accumulo was an Apache software project released in 2011 to the Apache Software Foundation Incubator. And I believe DataWave was open sourced on GitHub much later than that.
I have a question. Does DataWave have? Do you think that DataWave stands on its own outside of Accumulo, or will it only ever be used by Accumulo?
I'm going to start by saying I don't have a real answer to this. But
That's why we have you on the panel.
yeah, I know. But I think it's useful to look at other projects that have made it out of government spaces that were based on Accumulo when they came out. So like one of the obvious ones is GeoMesa, right, which went to the Eclipse Foundation. And it now runs on top of Accumulo, HBase, Cassandra, I think, like a bunch of things. Another one is Gaffer, which was a entity graph analysis framework that came out of GCHQ. And when it first came out, it was only based on top of Accumulo, and now it runs on Accumulo and HBase and maybe Mongo, I want to say. And so like DataWave seems pretty tied to Accumulo, at least from what I've watched so far today. But like that's just now. I think it'll depend on who gets involved in that open source project and how it gets driven, right? Like I was surprised that Gaffer added things that weren't Accumulo because its main participants are still just GCHQ, but for whatever reason they still saw fit to like try to do that.
Any other?
There's the compelling use case, and then is there a place to get iterators and patterns or see what other people have done?
No.
No, we didn't answer that. We're supposed to answer that.
Did we not answer?
We didn't answer it. We were supposed to.
Okay. The one of the questions is, if I want to start writing iterators, where's a good place for me to find examples of iterators for me to base my work off of? And who's going to answer that?
So you remember that time where we talked about documentation contributions? So there has been a restructuring. I don't know, gosh, it's probably about years ago now. There was a separation a very long time ago which tried to move internal system-specific iterators out of the sort of public-facing eye. So a long time there was a problem with looking at an iterator and being like, okay, should I actually do what this one does? And there really wasn't any way to tell unless you like went and looked at like, okay, what other code in Accumulo is referencing this? Like, I've never seen that class before. I probably shouldn't use this one. That one's, this sounds scary. I don't think I should use it. So there is a Org Apache Accumulo core iterators user or some package name that includes user, which was meant to be more curated. These are good examples of things that you can use to copy code from, essentially. So the user package iterators are definitely a good starting point. I know there are definitely, and on the other side of the coin, I would say ones that are in the system iterator package definitely don't look at those, because oftentimes those system level iterators are used in a very specific or a limited fashion, which avoids certain problems which you would run into as an end user. So you would want to avoid the system ones, but it's the curation and sort of a repository is one thing that actually as a community, we don't do very well. That would be something that we could get better at. I don't think any of us have a specific way of any feel on how exactly that would be done. I think we all be welcome to suggestions around that, but that's sort of what it is right now, RTFM or RTFC.
All right. I think we're close to the end here, but anybody want to fit in one last question? No? All right. Thanks, everybody. Round of applause for the panelists, please. All right, thank you. All right, well, thanks, everybody. And if you want to harass these guys, they'll be around for drinks or something, I think. All right, thanks, everybody.